My name is Peggy Datermeyer. I'm the McGee Fellow and the Director of the Community Bioethics and Aging Center here at the Hope and Healing Center. I recognize some of the names that are joining us today and see a lot of new names. So welcome to this program. We're absolutely blessed today to have with us Dr. Tim VanDuivendyk. And if I were to read all of his credentials and accolades, we'd be here all afternoon. So I'll just suffice it to say he's the retired Vice President of Spiritual Care at the Memorial Hermann Health System. He's a retired family therapist, a licensed marriage and family therapist. And most importantly, he's one of my dear friends and mentors. And we are really blessed to have him with us today to talk about journeying through the wilderness of grief. So without further ado, I'll turn the mic over to him, and we'll give y'all some time for questions at the end, and he also has a handout that he'll share with you at the end. So welcome, and take it away, Tim.
Okay, welcome everyone, and Peggy, thank you for the invitation and those kind words. A lot of years we've been together and walked the journey. Welcome everyone. We're going to be talking about the wilderness and ways of transforming through wilderness. Some of that will be the pandemic, losses of multiple types, the grieving process, which is so different for everyone. Let me start by defining grief. This is a definition that I use. Grief is a cognitive, emotive, behavioral, and spiritual adjustment after any loss or a loss out ahead that you fear might take place. Now that sounds very complicated, I know, so let me tell you why it's important to me. So many people think that grieving is really about emotions. It's about feelings. And we forget that it's about the way we think. Sometimes in grief, you can't think straight, or you overthink, or you can't clearly complete a sentence without your thoughts moving back to your losses. For sure, it's the emotions. It's the roller coaster of fear and anger and sadness, and back to anger just pops out at you. So the emotion is there, a very big part of the grieving process. But also our actions. Driving too fast when you're under grief and loss and getting a ticket. Not being able to function affects your action. Some people move into overdrive. In the midst of grieving and lose a loss, they'll get busier and work faster in the midst of the adjustment period. And obviously the spiritual struggle between faith and doubt and hope and despair and courage and fear, that is constantly amidst. All of who we are, is what I'm trying to say, is affected in the grieving process after a loss or before a perceived, feared loss in the future. Now, if we could circle up, and obviously we can't, and it's hard to have a discussion when I think over 50 or so are online with us, but I want to just talk about different types of losses for a moment. You might identify with some of them. You also have your own you might think about. The one type is what might be called sudden dramatic or traumatic loss. This would be death, a fire, a hurricane. Just suddenly something has happened, it's traumatic, it's an accident, it's a crash, and we are faced with that loss. Another type of loss we often forget about are the losses that come teaspoon by teaspoon, more the ambiguous losses. For instance, divorce may be a loss that has been going on for months and perhaps years, finally leading to the end of a relationship. One saw it teaspoon by teaspoon, and in some ways may not have grieved the process. Illness, a terminal diagnosis and the treatment process can be teaspoon by teaspoonful. And sometimes, even as we go through a slow dying process, suddenly in death, the volume, the bucketful hits us. We begin to process the larger gathering of the grief that perhaps we didn't process along the way. Geographic change. Many of us, through immigration, through migration, changing in our society from place to place, there is a loss happening, however small we think, that often is not processed, often not dealt with. We quickly rationalize it away or put it away rather than realize that which is being collected in the teaspoon by teaspoon. It's like the kettle that's boiling and takes a while, and then suddenly the kettle wants to be heard. It wants to be attended to. Grief is like that. It'll gather. The mourning will gather within us. This subtle, ambiguous loss may be what many people have experienced in this pandemic with this virus. We spent months knowing it would go away quickly, denying it. And although we wore some masks and we stayed away from friends and we kept our social distance, it was over months that little by little we had these losses and did not perhaps grieve them. And so they collected into a bucket full of losses. And they may say to you some morning, someday, hey, grieve me, process me, weep with me, mourn me, so that we can go on in healthy living. And that's what grief does for you. It helps you make the process of transformation and move on through to a new level. And in the pandemic, what have you lost? Many times of being with friends, many times activities and grandchildren, the family you cannot see or don't trust to see in the midst of all that's happening. You could go on and name multiple losses for me this morning. Think about the unique loss of having a loved one die during this virus, and the family cannot gather for the rituals, for the hugs, for the shared memories of your parents or your grandparents or family member or your child. So that there's not that time to do the grieving. It begins to be just sitting there in the pot. And it's like the teapot won't. So it won't come to boil, but it sits there and wants to be a part of the process, wants to be a part of your life. And it's important that we monitor this teaspoon by teaspoonful of loss, name them, grieve them, so that it doesn't ultimately pull us into frozenness, frozen grief, a frozen wilderness, if you will, because it's almost impossible to transform a wilderness, a loss, a grief that is frozen. It's important for us to weep it, to let it drain off, to let it have its say through tears or talk or sharing with friends. What I'm trying to say is that the catharsis of grief, the release that comes from grief, opens up new thoughts and new ways of thinking, new ways of being. There's another type of loss, though, I want to remind us of, and that is that the loss that comes over multiple losses. It becomes very complicated to where you may be dealing with this death, but it relates to losses you've had in the past 2-3 years, different types of losses. So we got to be aware of that wilderness that we're in, that may be quite complicated, and the grieving itself might be delayed. For instance, in a hurricane, in a fire, sometimes our fear and anxiety to survive becomes priority. It's what we kick into to protect our family, to protect whatever we can of ourselves, to move out quickly. And it's often later, after we deal with our survival needs and survival anxiety, that grief may come up. That grief may need to be dealt with. So we do have that delayed effect. I want to say to you and be heard as saying that the hope of grieving is transformation. That the hope of grieving is that we process our pain. It opens up to new ideas, new creative futures. It builds coping muscle, spiritual muscle, emotional muscle while we're doing our grief work, if you will. Helps us come to a deeper sense of ourselves, a clearer sense of ourselves. We grow. Now, there's some basic concepts I want to share with you that I believe about grieving. In this wilderness, we oftentimes don't know where we're going, and we're trying to transform this wilderness, and it is the grieving. And I want to just name some of my core thoughts that I believe about grieving itself. Some of these may sound crazy to you. I believe, and I try to articulate this in my book, The Unwanted Gift of Grief. I believe that grief is an unwanted gift, that it's given to us by our Creator to use, to embrace as a vehicle for releasing catharsis, rising up again, and going through the wilderness, not around it. And that what happens in grieving or loss is this vacuum is there of the person, of the event, the job, that which we've lost. It's an empty vacuum, and all of our emotions, our thoughts, our cognitions go into this empty space as we work it, and we internalize that which we have lost within us and go on living more fully because of what that person, that gift gave to us. So I'm trying to say that it literally is the emotions, the vehicle, the cognitions that get twisted sometimes, that we're using in order to rise up and through into that wilderness toward transformation. I believe that grief is the wilderness. It invites us to do grief work. That in this wilderness, there's so many paths. You've heard of paths like denial and shock and disbelief. Well, shoot, we've been in denial 6-7 months, or some of us, that this COVID is real. COVID-19 is real. We have a tendency. You've heard of the pathway of anger, frustration, irritability. Some people, particularly males, tend to do more with that one. And we say it's anger, but it can come out in impatience, irritability, frustration is a big part of that pathway in the wilderness. That's searching for a miracle when you've been diagnosed. You're searching for the treatment miracle is another part of the pathway. Searching for the miracle that this virus will be eliminated, will disappear, will have a vaccine, will rise up out of this someday. The wilderness is where we do grief work. I don't know how many of you had the experience of churning cream into butter. But if you've had that, you may have memories that pop up now. The wilderness invites us to churn life's cream into butter. In churning cream into butter, you work and you work and you work. Your muscles get tired. Sometimes you trade off. And slowly, in the midst of your substance, you see different form. You see curds here and curds there. Not all at once. You keep churning. And slowly, parts become one. And a new identity shapes while it separates itself from some of the cream, but takes on a new form. That's what happens in grieving. In the wilderness, we are coming to parts of our curdness, if you will. We're joining parts of ourselves. And in that, we cross the wilderness, we go into it, and we come out with new or refreshed identity, a creative self, not leaving that which we love behind, but taking with us internally. In us, we begin to shape new life, new creation, new resurrection, if you will, new identity and purpose in our lives. I also believe about grieving that you'll need a healthy faith function to get through. I mean, try to define those, the healthy faith function. On one hand, I see this inspirational, repressive faith function. It's a belief system, prayer, meditation, if you're yoga, whatever. It's a belief system and activity and practice that we use to push down our emotions, our pain, our wilderness, and if you will, smile in the storm. We can see a lot of that in our culture. Asking God to take it away, pushing down emotion, pushing down the grief. And here we have a God that's given us the vehicle of grieving in order to find new resurrection, new direction, new identity. But we find ourselves in this kind of faith function, giving it up to God, if you will, and smile through it. Now, there's another kind of faith function that I think is so important, and that is inspirational, expressive faith function. Here you take your beliefs, your prayers, your worship, your new age stuff, your yoga, and it gives you permission to express and release and openly confess, if you will, the pain of the valley of the shadow of death, the pain of your grief, the pain of your virus. And in releasing that, your lament, your anguish, your sorrows in Gethsemane, in releasing that, one finds within themselves space for new hope. When you do catharsis, there's a hope that can begin to be born under the emotions that trapped. Now, this is time. It's not something that happens overnight, not something that happens on a first catharsis or grief experience. But it's important to understand that our faith function, if it's healthy, will give us permission, as throughout biblical history did, lament, to anguish, if you will, to release our pain openly to God. If you go to Psalm 23, you see a little bit of the repressive, but if you go to Psalm 22, wow, my God, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from helping me? The freedom to say directly to God and to your fellow companions where that pain hurts helps you release it and find new hope and new energy under that which was blocked by the pain. If we were together, I'd probably ask you to be sure you understand and feel free to ask me about it. I want to go back to grief as the unwanted gift for a moment. Some people, when I talk about this, hear me saying that the loss of your child was the gift. And that's not what I'm saying. That the loss of your life through this virus, the loss was a gift. Oh no. That the divorce was a gift. No. What I'm trying to say is the grieving, that vehicle which our Creator has given us to use, becomes a gift as we churn it, as we work it, as we release it. We find new direction, and the gift begins to heal us, and we internalize the loss, living more fully and joyfully because we've internalized that loss within us. I know these are difficult concepts. I just don't want you to hear that I'm saying that your loss, your child's death, your death of your spouse, your fire, your hurricane, I'm not saying that was the gift of God. Also, I want you to hear me say that I do not believe that God caused your loss for a purpose up God's sleeve. I do believe that God is with us to try and work and find a purpose in our losses and of our losses. Are you hearing the difference? One is God causing it to happen to you for God's purpose. And the other is God is with you to face this, to walk this wilderness so that you can find purpose in it, meaning in it. So you find new life in it and through it. I have difficulty believing that God takes. We use that vocabulary a lot when someone dies, that God took him, God takes. I believe that God receives, that in our own death, God receives us to her comforting breast forever and eternally. And that's a covenant belief, covenant theology, that means that whether I'm in the mountaintop or in the valley, God is with me. Whether I live or whether I die, whether I have cancer or I don't have cancer, God is with me in helping me find meaning, hope, healing, even in the midst of death at times. One other concept I believe one needs in order to get through the wilderness in the midst of grieving is what I call sojourners. The last half of my book is all about how do you sojourn with another individual. It'll be very, very specific. If you go there and you're trying to teach someone how to sojourn with you, you're trying to sojourn with others. But a sojourner is one who, for a while, could listen, let you release, let you talk, let you cry, let you scream sometimes. Come back again at a later time, a week or whatever, daily maybe at first. But it's a person who will walk with you in the wilderness as if they step out of their shoes into your shoes, but they never take their shoes off. So that, yes, they're not in that wilderness every day. They're not in that wilderness constantly, but for a while they walk with you where you are in the wilderness, be with you, let you have your feelings, embrace your feelings, and when at the end of the time, they go back to their living and they trust you to go on with your living, and they circle back regularly for this moment of empathy, for this moment of love that comes through empathy, that they're emptying themselves into another person's view. Now, if your person you're walking with keeps trying to talk you out of your pain or say happy things, or thinks because we've had a lot of casseroles, you ought to be feeling better. That's probably not the sojourner you need. I'm not saying they don't love you or that they're not a great friend, but we need someone who, like Peggy, can listen to us when we hurt, so that it spurs our mourning in the midst of God's people, in the midst of communion, in the midst of community with another person, giving us hope and energy and new life. I think I'll turn the corner a bit. There is so much in the pandemic, in this virus, that is subtle loss. And as I was saying, teaspoon by teaspoon, finally leading to the bucketful. It is so important in making it through the wilderness and transforming loss. It's important that we become aware of these little teaspoons that begin to collect within. It doesn't mean fall apart and have your good cry on every teaspoonful. It means be aware that this is grieving. Be aware as you collect your times so that you can get with someone, a partner, a spouse, a loved one, a sojourner, and you begin to name them, because one of the key ways of getting through this wilderness with your sojourner is, whether it's on the phone or in social distance over coffee, it's a time in which we share the little teaspoons full of pain and losses that come through the virus. So I was reading in the New York Times, a number of psychologists have talked about how people, because they're not grieving or not mourning, they're ending up in a deeper level of depression because they put it away and they put it away and they put it away. And the importance of keeping that afresh, keeping that current, keeping that in our release and in our mourning and our grieving, helps us transform through this wilderness. True transformation is not easy. Peggy and I were just talking about the fact that I raise and release monarch butterflies. They go through a long transition period. You may have watched a butterfly move into that jay and slowly struggle to become a cocoon. You may have watched them work their way out of the cocoon into a new form called butterfly. Now, my videos only show 4 minutes and 30 seconds of moving from the cocoon to a wet butterfly waiting to dry out and fly 3 or 4 hours later. My other video is almost 4 minutes of a jade caterpillar moving into its green state of full cocoonness, where they stay for many, many days, sometimes weeks, in their transformation process. We need to understand that transformation comes sometimes because of our struggle. Watch your masochism. I don't mean go out and start your struggle, make your struggle. What I'm saying is that struggle can indeed lead to new self, new identity. Not leaving or forgetting about the old identity, but creating a deeper sense of self, a clearer sense of self. But it is hard work as we go through and finally find that promised life again, that promised land again, if you will, as we transform through the wilderness. Remember, Israel could not find the promised land. For years, they roamed different directions, lost in the wilderness, pathway after pathway. could not find the direction. And this can be the way it feels. So I don't think it's going to be 40 years, folks. I promise you, I don't think it'll be 40 days. I think 40 months is a good, realistic time, but everybody does this differently. It is so important to understand that when we talk about loss and grief and wilderness, each individual experiences this in their own way. Not always the way you experienced it. So to say to someone, oh yeah, that happened to me, may not be real helpful. But to say, hey, tell me more about what happened to you, may be very helpful to one who's really struggling in the wilderness. It's important to remember that every individual values differently, experiences a loss differently. There are some people with the money in the bank who are not experiencing the loss of a job the same way a young person who's just started and loses all income. It's perspective. It's the level of losses that can bring high anxieties as well as grief in the midst. And it's the transformation process that is so important to us as we move on into promised life, a new identity, new spiritual muscle, new emotional muscle, which can come because we did the hard work of struggle. We did the hard work of transformation and new birth, if you will. I'm going to turn the corner just a bit to be a little more specific on ways that you might transform your wilderness, whether that is death, whatever type it is, whether it is the virus that you're talking about, the pandemic. I want to be specific, but I want you to hear something. This doesn't work. These ideas don't work for everyone. What you're going to hear is me talk about the types of people that use these ideas. Some are helped more than others. For instance, there are these think people in our lives who primarily think their way to new emotions and new behaviors. They do well thinking through it and going on. There are also people, we usually marry the opposite. That's an interesting study. We'll come back and do another day. We tend to marry our opposite. There are other people who emotively feel their way to new thoughts and behaviors. Yet there's this other group of people that take action, fake it till you make it, people. They take action that is good and that leads them to new emotion and new thoughts. You probably enjoy one or more of those than other people. I mean, each person kind of has to look at themselves and say, well, do I emote? I tend to be an emoter. And if I can emote and release the pain, my thoughts start getting more creative. My energy picks up for behaviors. On the other hand, another person needs to think through, process through the cognitive thoughts. And then the emotion may come and the behaviors may change. So knowing yourself is important, but I'm going to talk about these three ways that might help you in the wilderness. And if you find yourself, no, that wouldn't help me, that's okay. Not only do we grieve differently, folks, we are helped differently. So if you will, let me talk about some of these ideas, knowing that some of these you have no interest in. Cody is going to later, don't do it yet, Cody, but he's going to show you more of the options of each of these than I'm going to discuss. But let me just pick out a few of the ways. For instance, here are some methods of feeling your way into new thoughts and new actions. So emoting your way to new thoughts and feelings. One is, in emoting, you clear the way for new ideas, actions, thoughts. So it's important to find someone you can emote with. Be aware of how feelings collect. And when they collect to the point of awareness, begin to process them with emotion, and that will release the emotion that grips you and causes perhaps your actions to be frozen or even your thoughts to be confused. Be sure that you process your feelings with a trusted friend, a trusted colleague. Not everyone knows how to receive our emotions. Either they back off or they try to get us out of the emotions. And what we're needing is for someone to help us in the catharsis. In this modality of moving into feelings in order to heal, it's important to pray real, to pray your emotion and feeling openly and honestly with your God, your higher power, your force, whatever words you give to that force beyond you. It is important not to hide in some pious belief that you're not supposed to show God the anguish or lament, but it's important to pray real. Now let's turn a little bit to the think people. These methods are hints around thinking your way into new emotions and new action. Don't panic, because Cody's going to send this out. Maybe it's already out. He's going to send it out in a moment, and you'll have it before you as you leave. It is important in the midst of these times, for instance, to cognitively move into gratitude and learn to be grateful for the small stuff, because it can feel like we're losing the big stuff. But to shape and form thoughts of gratitude. It's important to name our negative thoughts. And by the way, cognitive people tend to go into negative thoughts rather than emote their feelings. But it's important to, yes, name your negative thoughts, but not to dwell on the negative thoughts. To literally move your thoughts after you've named a negative into a positive place. Here's another thought, a way of managing. Think that worth and value is not limited to role, job, status, material things. You may be facing all of those in this virus. It's important to think of your worth and your value as more than the role that you have, or the job that you have, or the status in a culture, or the material things that you can buy. And to think, to shape your thoughts and continue to remind yourself that God, Allah, the force, higher power, will see you through this wilderness, this loss, storm, change, pandemic, and to keep repeating those cognitions yourself. Now, let me move over to the people who take action. I don't mean act like, but some of it's the action. Some of us get busy and active in the midst of grieving. Some even become workaholics, folks, and that's the way they do their grief. The ACT people can genuinely by taking action, move toward new feelings and new thoughts. For instance, a positive action can actually change your feelings and change your thoughts. You may know that doing something with your hands, knitting, darning, working in the garden, painting, that doing something with your hands in hobby, if you will, can literally draw out of your mind your feelings and your thoughts, causing your depression levels to go away, or not go away, but to lessen. Started to say to raise, but I meant lessen because of the action you're taking. The action people, rather than avoid change, the people get in the middle of change. They take action on what's happening, and they want to be a part of this change. And new feelings and thoughts come as a result of that. This is so important to all of us, but particularly those people who move into action help. Moving into prayer, meditation, purposeful silence and breathing is an action that can bring you to new feelings and to new thoughts. Some people talk about yoga this way. Some tennis players can name the ball their person they're mad at, or the god they're mad at, and they benefit from this action and release that comes in the midst of their behaviors. So it's so important, and at the heart of all of this is to eat and sleep and exercise and be healthy in a balanced way, which really is easier for those people who love action, love activities, than for those people who may just with emotion want to release the emotion and be for a while in the motion. All three of these are important. If you find yourself leaning toward one, you might think, oh, I may be a feel person. I may be a think person. I may be a take action person. It is underneath our propensities that we can find other levels of helping ourselves. So we try on various ways. And in the midst of all of this are the spiritual beliefs, that knowing that we are being transformed every day, knowing that change is an unwanted gift, but a gift. Knowing that a change can bring you to new possibilities and opportunities. Learning the faith balance of holding on to and letting go of is at the heart of the wilderness, at the heart of grieving and transformation. How do I hold on to the past, yet let go? How do I let go and let be, let go and let God? Very difficult gymnastics, emotionally, spiritually, but that is the kind of faith we need in the midst of all of our journeys. Obviously, believing in that God who transforms chaos, evil, pain, is with us to help us transform it so that we can find promised land, promised life through the wilderness and on into new identity and hope. Well, Cody, if you will, go ahead and, if you haven't already, go ahead and submit that one page so that people can look at that later. I did not begin to name 6, 7 under each one of these categories, but I just picked out a few that would communicate, hopefully, to you. I want to stop now. I think we have, Peggy, I think we have about 10 minutes. Maybe that's too much. I can go on, but I wonder if we can collect any question or thoughts that your individuals might have. Take some time to hear those questions or thoughts. Obviously, we can't go into deep thoughts, but
You're welcome to pipe in or write out your question. Anybody? I hear somebody in the background.
I see a little myself in all of these. Is that all that's written, Peggy? Connie, I think it's Connie. It's gone now from me.
I see a little of myself in all of these. Can a person be a mix of all? That's
Absolutely.
my question exactly.
Yes, absolutely. And by the way, women do better at this than men do, at balancing the parts of the brain, you know, with that corpus callosum dancing between the brains, and the parts of the brain are so much more effective for women. Maybe we men are coming around. But yes, you may find yourself being helped by all three of these methods of moving toward health and moving toward wholeness and healing again. I saw another question.
Yeah, please say something about anticipatory grief related to Alzheimer's.
Oh, yeah. And I would invite you to read Pauline Boss, B-O-S-S book, Ambiguous Loss, because she has just come out with a book that deals a lot with the ambiguity of this loss, because the person is there, yet the person we knew is not there. And it can create a stymiedness, a frozenness, because we can't fully grieve what it is we've lost in that individual. That's one of the teaspoon by teaspoon losses. And you watch it right before your eyes, and it's so subtle at times. You don't give yourself time or permission to grieve. And then it collects. And maybe you're with a trusted friend, or maybe a trusted God, if you will, and you're able to drain it, to name it, to feel it. But you'll have those times over and over and over in the journey toward a physical death with someone that you've watched go through this emotionally, cognitively with you.
And the author's name is Pauline Boss, B-O-S-S?
B-O-S-S, ambiguous loss.
Okay, thank you. Here's another question. What, in your opinion, is the best way to help a congregation grieve the losses of COVID?
Yeah. It would be excellent if we could, in every church, train sojourners. Remember, I mentioned the last half of my book is how do you sojourn? What does that mean? How do you listen? If our churches could develop 15, 20 people into good, solid sojourners, listeners, caregivers, and then they in turn maybe develop and call three people a week or 4 people, whatever that is decided and they can do. And on the phone, tell them you just want to listen and see how they're doing. That is a big primary way. Physical, food, testing, loss of job. How can we as the church be a part of food banks and a part of encouraging testing in the community, or helping with mental health clinics in the community? So there are ways we can volunteer in these organizations, not just as the listener sojourner, but as one who contributes themselves. And by the way, when we love another in those actions, we tend to find ourselves energized. So one of the key things to getting through the wilderness is to care for and serve others, and that mysteriously fills us up.
Here's some other suggestions for that. Spiritual directors, Community of Hope lay chaplains, and Stevens Ministries, which some churches have.
And is there a question there?
No, there's just information.
Please, yes. And that is what I meant earlier about training people in our congregations. the three organizations, you went Community of Hope, and what were the three you named? I don't have that in front of me.
Spiritual directors,
Yep.
Community of Hope, and Stevens Ministers.
I have trained and been with congregations in all three of these areas. Spiritual directions we forget about. I mean, the cynical, which is now moved to a level of they've released that name and they have a new name, I'm sorry, just happened the last few months. I have for years supervised the directors as they work with people in direction. And you are so correct by naming those. The Emmaus Center, someone just printed it up. That's the new center name for the cynical, which got flooded out, you may remember. Excellent, excellent directors, spiritual directors, but also the Hope Mission, Stevens Ministry, all of that is so important in our culture.
And somebody has posted, I have clients that cannot overcome trauma and grief years old, no matter how much we work at it. Any suggestions?
Oh boy. It sounds like a therapist or a minister who's really gone deep. Many times it's because the loss is out of consciousness, perhaps happened before 5, 6, 7, 8. There are a number of people who have disassociated from their losses, and that happens a lot of times before puberty. Now that also can drive us to addictions. If you're working with addiction or alcoholism, you will frequently find that that addiction is driven by a loss that is not processed, not experienced. So what is being said here is very complicated. You can't dig it out. You can be the trusted friend, encourage them to name it, invite them somewhat back into the past to see if this has happened before. Well, I have a diagram called the grief journey, in which I ask people to draw out this journey of losses they perceive in their lives. And then I ask them to come together as a group and share their lost journey. This might help someone because there's so many different types of losses in the eye of the beholder. What I think is a loss may not be for you. So that would be another way of helping a group or an individual. If you see that helping this person go deep, deep, deep into the loss causes them to lose their homeostasis, their ability to function, you may want to not help them go into the deep loss, but to help them to get help with a psychiatrist or a physician or a licensed therapist.
Here's a comment from someone. This was very helpful. I work with 500 plus seniors who are accustomed to being at a community center multiple times a week and are now at home alone. As I call them weekly, they need to hear much of what you share. I appreciate it. Took lots of quotes and will share. The average age is 88, so they're not computer savvy and don't have desire or energy to read a book, but your presentation will help me greatly. Here's another good question. How do you help someone with grief when they're across the country? I can't hear you. Ooh, what happened?
You can't hear me?
Now I can.
Okay. Obviously, the telephone and Zooming virtual, that is a real gift in our culture right now. My wife just got through with Zooming with her friends in a group for an hour before I got on this to Zoom with you. But that can help for those across the country. Obviously, the eyes and the ears and the face, even masked face, can be a real gift from God to another person. And it's really harder to do it that way. But I think more and more we're learning this is the way we must do this for a while. Through the telephone, through the virtual, the video.
Yeah, and somebody here says, I have a friend that sends cards, especially on birthdays, etc.
Excellent.
Writing notes is something we've gotten away from, but I think we should rediscover in this time.
Yes. Elders in a center may not know how to use the virtual, but you could perhaps work with the center's leadership and have a group voluntarily, not push it on them, but a group who are interested come to a room in the center of their home, their nurse center or whatever, and watch this video and see if it would be helpful.